Recording in progress. I'll just turn on the transcript, and then I'll just hide that transcript. Okay, so I'm delighted to welcome everybody to the first PRIISM seminar of the fall semester. And today we are lucky to be joined by Professor Elizabeth Ananat. Professor Elizabeth Ananat is the Mallya Chair in Women in Economics at Barnard College at Columbia University. She received a BA in Political Economy and Mathematics from Williams College, a Master's in Public Policy from the University of Michigan, and a PhD in Economics from MIT. In 2010, she served as the Senior Economist for Labor, Education, and Welfare at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and her research focuses on the intergenerational dynamics of poverty and inequality, with an emphasis on causal identification and policy relevance. And we're so delighted to have you here today. And please take it away.
Thanks so much, Ravi and Daphna for having me, and Susanna for organizing. Very excited to be here. And the upside of being virtual today is that we all get to stay dry. So I am going to share my screen now. And please, everyone, just let me know if you can't see things, but everybody can see? Great. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about the effects of the expanded child tax credit on material hardship and parental labor supply. This is actually sort of an amalgamation of two papers. The first written with Zach Perlin, Sophie Collier, Megan Curran, and Chris Weimer, and the second written with Ben Glasner, Crystal Hamilton, and Zach Perlin. And these are all folks at the Columbia Center on Poverty and Social Policy. We've been doing a lot of work on the effects of the expanded child tax credit. Some of it you may have seen in the media if you follow any of the discourse around the expanded child tax credit from last year. And so some of these results may seem familiar, but I'm going to show you sort of what underlies them. So the motivation for looking at this question is the fact that there was this sort of huge policy change that occurred in 2021. The child tax credit has been a tax break for families with kids since the 1990s. It was expanded several times over the last several decades, but it used to be structured in kind of a funny way. It used to miss the lowest income, so it was money to help you raise your kids, but it didn't actually go to the lowest income families. And the reason is that it was phased in with earnings. So it functioned as an earning subsidy. For every $100 that you earned, the government would kick in an additional tax credit of $15. So it functioned as a wage subsidy that phased in with earnings. It was only partially refundable, which means that if for other reasons you didn't owe a lot of taxes, you wouldn't necessarily get the full amount of the credit. So it was worth less to lower income families than to higher income families. That meant that a third of kids didn't get the full amount of the credit that is supposed to be to help families with the cost of raising children. That included half of Black and Hispanic kids, and the poorest 10% of kids got nothing out of this tax credit. So in 2021, there was a change under the American Rescue Plan for 1 year only. It was no longer phased in with earnings, right? So now everybody gets this tax credit. So if you earn nothing, you still get the full amount of the credit. It was made fully refundable. So regardless of how much you owe in taxes, you got the full amount of the credit. If you didn't owe taxes, they would just send you a check for the amount of the credit instead of reducing the amount of taxes you owed. And there was a large increase in benefits. The maximum credit had been $2,000 per child, and this increased to $3,000 per child aged 6 to 17 and $3,600 per child under the age of 6. The notion being that young children are particularly expensive. Half of it was distributed monthly over the second half of 2021. So folks actually got checks or direct deposit each month to help pay for kids. It previously had just all showed up in a lump sum at tax time. So this is the first time that folks just were from the government for the cost of raising kids, seeing money show up in their bank account every month to help, with expenses. This was very novel for the United States, but is actually incredibly common in other rich countries. Most rich countries have what's called a child allowance, or just a recognition that children are expensive and that children having what they need is beneficial for society. So if you talk to folks from European countries, they'll often say with surprise, but you don't get child money because they get child money that just shows up because you have a kid. So that's what we were sort of trying to do for this experiment for basically 6 months. It was intended to reduce poverty and material hardship. So the first thing we wanted to look at was, did it? It also, folks who criticized the policy were concerned that it could have the unintended effect of reducing parent work, both because it provides money, which is, one of the reasons people work. So maybe now you don't have as much need to work, and because the old system had this wage subsidy, right? It made work pay better. And so now with the new system, there's no subsidy. So maybe that makes people not as interested in working. So we're going to look at both of those questions. The method we're going to use is difference in differences. My understanding is it's a few people maybe not familiar with this, so I'm just going to go over it briefly. So differences in differences is super common in economics. We use it when there's a natural experiment. So that is, as opposed to a randomized experiment, this is a real world change that happens not because of the researcher, but that quasi-randomly or just arbitrarily affects some people and places, but not otherwise similar people or places, right? So if a policy is enacted and it takes place in Massachusetts, but not Vermont, right? That's not random, right? But it's sort of arbitrary. These are similar places, and you can sort of think of the people in Vermont as being a decent control for the people in Massachusetts in some ways. I can hear you all thinking, well, they're for sure not a perfect control, and differences in differences doesn't treat them as a perfect control. It doesn't assume the treatment controls that are identical and that the control group provides the counterfactual outcome for the treatment group, right? It does not assume that. Instead, it makes a weaker assumption for the counterfactual called parallel trends. So that is that the change in the control group outcome from pre to post provides the counterfactual change for the treatment group. Because if you're looking at a policy change in Massachusetts and you say, they did an intervention to reduce infant mortality, let's say. Well, from the pre to the post, infant mortality went down. Hey, that's great. Is that really because of the treatment, or would it have gone down anyway? Well, when you look at Vermont, you're not saying however much infant mortality there is in Vermont is what there would have been in Massachusetts, because Vermont may have had different levels to begin with. What you are saying is the overtime change in Vermont is going to capture sort of the things that are going on overall in infant mortality. And if there's an additional change in Massachusetts relative to the change that occurred in Vermont, then we're going to attribute that additional change to the treatment. Okay. So the challenge for us is this policy was implemented nationwide. So you don't have this convenient, this state did it and this state didn't. So who should be the control group? There is no perfect control group. That's usually the case in differences actually. So we're going to use a few different options. One thing we're going to do is people without children, right? So they did not get this money. So if we look at their material hardship and their work, that's pretty straightforward, right? How those things change. But do we think that people without children would have otherwise similar overtime trends, or do we think there are other things over the same period when this is implemented that are going to change the behavior of people without children differently than the people with children? So we're also going to use a couple of treatment intensity definitions. So that is, it's not that some people got this treatment and some didn't, but some people with kids got more treatment than other people did. So some people got smaller increases in their CTC because of differences in the number of kids, right? So you might think people with 2 kids versus people with 3 kids. Well, the people with 2 kids, their CTC went up by $1,000 a kid, so $2,000. The people with 3 kids, it went up by $3,000. That's a bigger treatment. Some people had just 1 kid. That kid was 5 versus 6. The person with a 5-year-old got a larger increase than the person with a 6-year-old. Some people were already getting the maximum credit before because they were earning enough. Their CTC went up by $1,000 per kid. Other people were in that phase-in range and they were getting less than the full amount of the credit. Now they also get topped up to this new $3,000 credit. They got a bigger treatment. So we're going to look at that form of treatment intensity to see, did people who got more additional cash have bigger changes in their outcomes than people who got less additional cash. And then when we think about, well, what about this work subsidy, right? This change in your wage. Well, for the same reasons that the amount of CTC changed, also the work subsidy decreased by different amounts for different people. And while it sounds like those two are the same thing, the change in the amount of the credit and the change in the work subsidy, they actually are different and they affect different people. And I will show you that later when we look at it. Okay, so the data we use is it, sorry, I'm going to stop there. Ravi, Daphna, are there questions?
We're good.
We're good. Okay, great. Do feel free to ask questions during. Economists get nervous when we only hear the crickets. Okay, so the data we're going to use are new data that were implemented during the pandemic because the US Census Bureau was like, hey, things are happening super fast during this pandemic. A lot of things are changing fast. The types of data collection that we've had to keep track of how people are doing in this country aren't fast enough and responsive enough to let us keep track of how people are doing now. So they fielded a new survey called the Pulse survey that is collected online. There are various issues with doing that online versus the traditional way the Census Bureau has collected data, but it's for sure the best thing we have for keeping track of real-time outcomes during the pandemic in sort of the basic measures of well-being. We're going to use Pulse data collected between April 14th, 2021, which is 3 months before the start of the CTC. In other work that I'm not going to show you today, we have looked farther back to like January, and none of our results change. And then December 13th, 2021, that's the latest time point available during the time when the CTC is enacted. We have also extended it and looked what happens when you phase out of the CTC, but nothing is different in any of our results. And there was sadly a pause in the collection of the Pulse over January, so that we don't actually have data from that first month when the CTC was withdrawn. We're going to measure the effect of CTC payments that occurred from July 15th, which is the first payment, to November 15th, which is the 5th and next to last payment. We can't see the effects of that December 15th payment because of the Pulse pause. Okay, so our data is going to include the effects of 5 monthly CTC payments over a time span that covers 3 months prior to 5 months after. And what the Pulse does that we didn't used to get frequent information on is it asks about a lot of household well-being aspects, including food insufficiency, right? So in the last 7 days, which of these statements best describes the food eaten in your household? We're going to define food insufficiency as a person saying sometimes or often not enough to eat. If you define it just as often not enough to eat, our results look very similar. Difficulty with expenses. So how difficult has it been in the last 7 days for your household to pay for usual household expenses? Qualifying response is somewhat or very difficult. And then another question that's on housing hardship that you'll notice is a different time frame. And it just says, is this household currently caught up on rent or mortgage payments? And if they say no, we're going to find that as housing hardship. But note that that's going to be a much harder thing for a monthly CTC to affect, right? Because this is, you could acquire, and many people did during the pandemic, large housing cost arrears. And a check for a few $100s for a month is not going to be able to dig, it might help you pay the rent that month. It won't necessarily help you become caught up. So, but it's the question that we have. Okay, so this is just the equation for the basic differences and the differences. We'll have an indicator for, this is in the post period for the treatment, so July to December versus April to June. That's the, once this is implemented, Do things change? Do they change similarly for the treatment and control group? That's what beta 1 captures. Beta 2 is, in general, do people in the treatment group look different from people in the control group? That's generally going to be true because we don't think they're exactly alike. And then beta 3 is the parameter that we're interested in. It's the interaction of the treatment and the post, right? So what's the effect of the program over and above the general change in that outcome over time? So Y is going to be a measure of material hardship. Those 3 things I showed you before for a given family. I said that. And then the treatment is going to be measured. For this part, I'm going to show you the binary, whether the household has children or not, and this continuous estimate of the difference between their predicted new CTC benefit and their old one as a function of the number of children and adults in the household and prior earnings. We're going to control for age, sex, and education status of the household head. We're also going to include state and week fixed effects and interactions of treatment status with other week-by-week state policy changes that could be happening over this time in other programs, particularly unemployment insurance and SNAP, which is food assistance. Okay. And if any of you, yes, Robbie.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was just wondering, related to that last point, if the CTC expansion was co-enacted with other policies, or it was like a standalone thing.
So it was co-enacted in March as part of the American Rescue Plan, but it was implemented at a time when that first check came on July 15th, there wasn't anything else that was changing right at that time.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
But there were a bunch of things changing. There's sort of constant churn in policies over 2021, particularly by state, and that's exactly why we've got both week and state fixed effects and these week by week state policy metrics.
Thank you.
Absolutely, great question.
Can I also ask a quick question?
Please.
I'm curious if there's any benefit to thinking about these as repeated monthly treatments, so like multiple treatments instead of just thinking of post July 15th as a single treatment.
So I'm going to show you both so absolutely, and I'm sort of trying to target this talk to both to folks who are newer and folks who are farther along and thinking about this stuff. I'm going to show just some plots for the raw outcomes for people with and without kids over time. And then at the end, I'm also going to, assuming we have time, show some event study and some, of our newer, like Callaway and Santana estimates of when we break these into individual experiments. And I'll for those of you who don't understand what I just said, I will explain it when I get to it later, but I'm pretty sure that Robert did. Okay, so he looks more satisfied. Yes, so it's not that we haven't kept up on the literature. Okay, so here we go, Robert. Here's your first plot. Okay, so this is food insufficiency for everybody, just raw plots over time for households without children. You can see that that trend looks pretty parallel as we would want it to in the pre-period, and it also looks pretty flat. Nothing seems to happen around July 15th, right, to food insufficiency for households without children. Households with children, they have higher food insufficiency to begin with. Families with children are hungrier in our country than families without children. And then you can see, a drop, right when the policy expands, and then that's pretty steady afterward. And if I did extend this to 21, it would pop right back up when we get to the February measure. There we go. When we look at low income families, so this is restricting to families in the bottom quartile of the income distribution, we see that the levels are higher, right, including for families without children. The gap is bigger, and the reduction in that gap is much more prominent, right? So these are folks who are particularly high risk for food insufficiency. These are folks who had particularly large increases in the CTC when the policy changed, because most of them were not eligible for the full amount before. And so this all sort of helps us pass the sniff test. When we look at difficulty with expenses, we don't see as much. We are later going to look at this with all those sort of controls and stuff like that. And we think that we have some suggestive evidence that difficulty with expenses helps particularly some the worse off groups, but we don't see anything dramatic. This sort of fits in with the notion that this isn't a ton of money. Folks spend it on food, and we know that that's true. Primarily, people spend it on different things, but many people spend it on food. And then when we look at being caught up on rent or mortgage, we see very little. But in all of these cases, it looks like the households without children are relatively decent controls for households with children. If we put this into the regression frame.
I'm sorry, before you go on. So can you go back to that slide? Absolutely. And I'm sorry if I missed it. Are all of these like percentages, and these are 0, 1 variables, and then I'm just trying to understand the scale here.
Yes. So this is the percent of families reporting these outcomes. Okay. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. and they're all defined as I showed on that. Food insufficiency. This is if you said either sometimes or often over the past 7 days, your family did not have enough to eat.
Yeah, you did it.
No worries.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And did you divide these out by whether they said sometimes or always? Like, was the
so we have done it coding just the often as opposed to the sometimes, and the results are very similar. Obviously, the rates are lower.
Oh.
Okay, so this is just the regression framework rather than the just overtime plot for that same definition of the treatment. And there you see that treatment group times post is significant both for food insufficiency and for difficulty with expenses. Once you get sort of the other controls in, it's still pretty much 0 for missed rent or mortgage. So now let's look at this. You could be worried because really families without children are experiencing different things over this period than families with children. There are a lot of challenges, particularly to having children during the pandemic. And so you might want to look at a comparison group that is also families with children. And so here we turn to this continuous treatment estimate. So what we call measuring a dose response relationship. So everybody here is treated, but some are more treated than others. Now, when we do this, we have the problem that we don't observe how much people used to get into this in the CTC and how much they get now. And also, if we did observe that, we still wouldn't want to use it because we want to use intent to treat, the policy intended to treat you rather than your actual compliance with the policy. Okay. But the solution is to simulate the CTC change based on the fixed characteristics of families. So we don't actually have all the data that we need in order to do that in the pulse. So we're going to actually use a 2-sample approach to figuring this out. What we do is in the pulse, we place families into bins based on the number of kids in the family, the number of adults in the family, and their income. And that's 8 categories from less than $25,000 to more than $200,000 in household income. And then we go to the 2019 US current population survey data. So this is the traditional census data set that keeps track of a lot of aspects of American families. It's not super responsive and updated, but it has really solid data on families, and it has a lot more information on income, including overtime information. The pulse, of course, didn't start until 2020, so you can't really get pre-pandemic data from the pulse. So we look in the CPS at each family unit that is observed and figure out how much they would have been eligible for under the pre-reform CTC. And then we look at how much additional they are eligible for because of the change in the CTC. We subtract the pre-reform benefit from the post to get a net benefit indicator for each family unit. We then do another adjustment. If you don't like this adjustment, don't worry, because the results look exactly the same if you don't make this adjustment. But I like this adjustment because when we say, okay, families with 3 children get more money than families with 2 children under this program, so families with 3 children are more treated. Well, there's actually a reason that families with 3 children get more money, right? Which is that 3 children cost more than 2 children. So you haven't necessarily expanded the family's budget by, the family's means relative to their needs by 50% when you go from $2,000 to $3,000, is if the reason that you go from $2,000 to $3,000 is that you have more mouths to feed, right? On the other hand, we know that an additional child doesn't cost as much as the first child because of economies of scale. So what we do is we adjust this net benefit indicator for family size using the OECD equivalent scale that basically says, look, the cost for running a family is 100% of the cost for the first adult, half of that initial cost for each additional child, and 30% of that additional cost for additional adults. And so we're going to basically measure the income to needs increase that your family experiences by adjusting the cash amount that you now get in addition by the needs amount that we think your larger family needs, but basically just dividing by that number. And then we calculate the weighted mean of the size adjusted net benefit value that we've calculated for each group of families. Remember, defined above as the number of kids by the number of adults by the income category. And we bring that back from the CTC into the pulse and say, this is what families that looked like yours on average should have gotten according to the policy guidelines based on the increase in the benefit under the policy. Does that make sense? Great. Okay. So this is what this ends up looking like. Our predicted increase in the transfer per month for families with 1 child at 0 income. It's needs adjusted a little under $200 per month increase in transfers in household budget, right? That's pretty stable over the period, over the amount of earnings for which you basically didn't used to get the CTC at all. And then it falls a little bit during what would have been the phase-in period of getting, you used to get some CTC as your income went up, and then it's smaller for folks with higher incomes because they used to be maxed out on the old CTC, so the only increase that they experience is that increase from the increase in the level of the benefit. And then up here, this is where the phase out in the benefit occurs. If you get up to $400,000, you actually don't receive the CTC anymore at all. I'm sure you all are heartbroken for the families that aren't getting that money. And then, of course, if you have more children, you get more money, but the pattern looks similar, right? Big amounts that are pretty constant for the lowest income families. But then you can see that that the phase-in has a bigger effect for those larger families. Questions about this? So what this means is we can compare families with different levels of income and say, for a 3-child family, if you earned 0, you got a little over $600 a month in increased CTC, whereas if you were a higher income family, you got $450 a month. That's a little dodgy because we think that low income families are affected very differently from high income families, but you can also say, we're going to look at a family that earns $67,000. They have bigger increases if they have more children, or you can do sort of this combination of using, we're going to control for your income, we're going to control for your family size, and we're going to use that family size by income, which is implicitly what our dose effect does, combined with indicators for family size and income. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is mostly comparisons within income group, because we feel less comfortable comparing folks across income groups than we do within income groups in the number of children. And when you do that, you see for the lowest income groups, very large decreases in food insufficiency. And that's true if you use that binary treatment that compares people with and without children. It's also true if you look at that continuous treatment. Now the plot points here are for $100 increase in your net CTC. But remember that most people got on average, like at least a $200 increase in net CTC, and many of them got higher increases in CTC than that. So if you multiply these, then you get actually bigger effects using our continuous treatment. So comparing families with children to each other. And so basically for all of our low income families, both the poorest families and the next lowest income group of families, so folks earning less than $35,000 a year, we see really big impacts on food insecurity. And then we see very little for these higher income families. These higher income families have pretty low rates of food insufficiency to begin with. When we look at difficulty with expenses, what we see is there's some action here for this lowest income group, and then not much for the higher income groups. And as always, we don't see anything for rent and mortgage payments. So this is not getting folks out of their housing arrears. That's not a sort of a result that the CTC is able to pull off. Okay, so I think a lot of you, this is a little bit old news because you've seen, often you may have seen researchers at Columbia found that the CTC had all these great effects on material hardship and poverty. This is the work that underlies those results that have been reported a lot. But yet this policy wasn't continued. The original hope of the people who implemented this policy was that it would be continued, and that didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Well, because a lot of politicians were worried about parent labor supply. They said, we're faced this crisis of there aren't enough workers. It's driving inflation. It's driving all of these problems. And we think it's partly because parents are getting this sweet deal now where they get money when they don't work. And we took away this old wage subsidy that they used to get. So we wanted to also look at parent labor supply. So how did the expanded CTC affect this? As I mentioned, the old CTC was phased in as a 15% supplement to earnings. When we get rid of that phase in, it represents basically a 13% cut in your effective wage, right? In reality, it always turns out to be a smaller than 13% cut because of the phase-in's interactions with other aspects of the tax code, but it is for sure a cut in, how much you used to increase your family's budget when you worked an hour. It's smaller now. Because in addition to that, the new CTC, so the new CTC provides this unconditional transfer. You get it whether you work or not, so it's no longer a subsidy to working. I'm an economist. We're not all economists here, so I'm going to just say what the neoclassical economics implications are of these two aspects of the policy change, because they're actually separate. So one is this cut in wage will discourage work, right? So when you get $10 for doing an hour of work instead of $11.50, work is not as attractive, right? That usually doesn't necessarily cause you to work less, though, because if you're getting paid less, so you don't have as much money to feed yourself, and if you work less, then you'll have even less money, right, to feed yourself than you did before. So cutting the wage maybe doesn't discourage work as much as, if you cut the return to some other activity, people might cut back more, right? But here, that's not the situation, right? Work pays less than it did before, but you're not poorer than you were before, because you also now get this money whether you work or not. It made families richer, right? So that increase in non-labor income, we usually think if someone wins the lottery that they don't decide to increase their hours at work, right? We usually think that an increase in non-labor income will cause people to reduce work. Why would we think that this didn't happen in this case? Why don't we just call it a day and say, okay, this definitely cut parents' work? Well, because people have actually looked at the effect of other child allowances, like in Canada, and that's actually convinced economists that this second point, the increase in non-labor income, does not actually cause people to reduce work maybe if you gave people $1 billion, but not at the amounts that we're talking about. It doesn't actually cause a reduction in parent labor supply. However, this wage cut effect, when we've looked at other countries that have introduced child allowances, those child allowances didn't replace previous programs that were wage subsidies. So maybe this wage cut thing is still happening and parents will work less in response to the wage cut. And there was a bunch of literature right when the CTC was first expanded that basically conducted simulations based on these neoclassical economics assumptions and said, look, parent work is going to fall. And those estimates range from like 0.8% reduction in parent employment to almost 3%. And many politicians also assume this is true, which is, so it's not just neoclassical economics that says this, and that's part of why the program was discontinued. So why wouldn't the CTC reduce employment? Spoiler alert, we find the CTC doesn't reduce employment. So we do want to think about why the story that I just told, which maybe seemed self-evident to some of you, wouldn't necessarily hold. So the first thing is that labor supply elasticity, so how responsive people's labor supply is to the wage, has been falling in the United States over time. And the consensus estimates that were used in those simulations are based on old papers. So what has changed since then? Well, for one thing, there used to be in this country a form of cash assistance called AFDC that basically gave people money when they didn't work and took it away when they did work, leading them to face basically they were poorer if they worked than if they didn't work. That's not what the CTC does, but a lot of the labor supply elasticities were from an era in which that was one of the policies that was driving labor supply choices. Secondly, there's been an increasingly volatile nature of low wage work with unstable hours, right? Where people can't predict how much they're going to work. They lose their jobs very easily, partly because of the decline in unionization of low wage work. And snowball effects from that can mean you lose your job, then you can't pay for childcare, then you can't take a new job because you don't have anywhere to put your kid. Your car breaks down, you miss a shift at work, so you lose your job, so then you can't pay to repair your car, so then you can't get a new job, right? So we call this in economics liquidity constraints. There are small investments you could make that would help you work, but you don't have access to money to make those small investments. If that's driving a lot of the unstable work participation among low-income families that we observe in the United States, where a lot of folks are working some of the year, but they're not able to work full-time full year, then it may be that actually giving them a little bit of money every month that they can count on helps them maintain employment. So there might in fact be countervailing positive effects of non-labor income on labor force participation. And that is consistent with the survey evidence that we see in the CTC, where when folks ask people how has the CTC changed things for you, as many people report that it has helped them increase work as report that it has helped them cut back on hours. And more than 10% of recipients, for example, have used that monthly CTC to pay for childcare, which is of course an investment in their labor supply. So our approach, we're going to use the pulse data. We're also going to use the current population survey because that asks about employment and about labor force participation, which is whether you're looking for work, even if you don't have a job right now. We're going to use the treatments that I showed you before, children versus no children, and hundreds of dollars per month in increased CTC. That tests that income effect, right? Does having more money cause you to work less? But also, we're going to estimate this change in the return to work. So does work paying less cause you to work less? And down at the bottom here, I've got that income effect estimate that we created before. You're familiar with it already. Up above is the change in your net, in your relative wage. And what you see is for the poorest families, they actually didn't lose a wage subsidy because they didn't have a wage subsidy before, right? So they don't actually experience any change in the net wage. Similarly, high income families that are mostly in the phase out range also don't lose a wage subsidy. But folks in this middle income range had if you had a 3-child family, on average you were getting a 6% bump in your, or you were getting a 7% bump in your wage before from the CTC, and so you're now facing a 6% wage cut. So you can see maybe if we use this definition, we would find that there was no effect, but that's because we've misspecified the treatment that's actually driving people's choices. So we've got this other specification of what the treatment is that's about the return to work rather than how much money you have. However, when we look at just the overtime plots, we see there's just not much going on at all. When we look at people with no children versus people with children, these trends look parallel, and they also don't look like anything happens in July, right? If we do this in the regression framework, similarly, regardless of which of these three treatments you define it as, we see basically no effect on either employment or labor force participation, and that's true in both the CPS and the pulse. When we look by income, similarly, I've got 60 plot points here, and one of them is significant, which is less than you would expect by chance, in fact. So again, we're not seeing any effect on work. Okay. Maybe you believed me that food insufficiency would fall when we give people money, but you're much less likely to believe me when I say that this money and this change in wage subsidy didn't affect parent work. And maybe you think, if you're Richard, Robert, somebody asked this question at the beginning. You know, there are a lot of concerns. I'm really sorry, I forgot your name. There are a lot of concerns these days with the sort of fancy version of differences and differences that I showed you. The simple story that I told you at the beginning about Massachusetts versus Vermont, pre and post, was a very clean story. You have 4 data points, right? And you just look, you've got one treatment group, one control group, one pre-period, one post-period. I told you that story, and then I introduced something with all of these weak fixed effects and interactions of the treatment status with these state policies and a bunch of other stuff. And it turns out that when you do all that fancy stuff, it might sound good. It sometimes leads to funny things when you actually, you know, plug that into a statistics program, where you end up, for example, weighting some observations negatively. Negative weights is usually not considered a good thing. If we go back to basics, right, let's just do one treatment and one control group, one period at a time, we can get back to, okay, now we actually have some confidence about what we're seeing. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you an event study, where what this is it basically defines the treatment group here is people with kids, and the control group is people without kids, super clean. And we're just going to run a regression for the month of April. So what's the difference in labor force participation for the month of April? Here's a separate regression where we do that for the month of May. We've got zeros. Here is a regression for the month of July, a separate regression for the month of August, September, October, November. And if this actually decreased parent labor supply, what we should see is that those regressions would give you estimates that were negative, right? And if any of these aren't significant, because these are the standard error bars, but they're certainly not negative. Similarly with employed, we don't see that either. What if instead we say, okay, we want to look within, we want to look at that variation in the amount of income, right, that people are getting. But again, we want this to be clean, not this very complicated formula that you showed us for how we're defining treatment intensity. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you families that received $100 in increased CTC. That's the only treatment group, compared to families without children. Okay, if that's the only treatment group, there's an insignificant decrease in employment. I'm going to show you families with exactly $225 increase in additional CTC compared to families without children. There you see an insignificant increase in employment. Across all of these mini experiments that we run, we see a mix of positive and negatives. We don't see any clear patterns. It doesn't look like there's any relationship here between getting this and a meaningful change in your labor supply. What if instead we use this variation in treatment in treatment by child age and number of children? Okay, so let's look compared to families without kids, our only treatment group is people who have 0 kids aged 0 to 6 and 1 child aged 6 to 18. A positive and insignificant effect on work. That's similarly true for all of these different, if we drop everybody else out of the sample and we just look at people without children versus people with 1 young child and 1 older child, we also see no effect on work of the CTC kicking in. So basically, any way I try to show you this, we're just not seeing any action. The official technical term for this is bupkis. Similarly, if we do it by, let's look just at the people who experience a 1% decrease in their wage, we don't see anything. Even people with a 90% decrease in their wage relative to people without children, nothing. So we really don't think there's anything there. In conclusion, we find that the expanded CTC strongly reduced food insufficiency by about 20%, especially among low-income families where it fell by almost half. Most especially among Black and Hispanic low-income families where it fell by 2/3. I didn't show you that. It also increased the ability to meet basic expenses among those lowest income families, and that was especially true among low-income Black families. However, not all eligible families received. The IRS estimates that 83% did. Pulse respondents report even lower recipiency rates. And in particular, the receipt is lower among low-income families, who are, of course, those who benefit most. An implication there is that increased outreach would likely increase the effects of the expanded CTC. And then our employment analyses do not support the claim that the CTC has countervailing disemployment effects that offset its benefits for reducing material hardship. Of course, if it discouraged work among families, then people might not end up less hungry in the end. But if it has no effect on work, then this just makes families better off and helps reduce material hardship. And based partly on this work that I've showed you today, Governor Hochul is now considering creating an expanded CTC for New York that will be called the Empire State Child Credit. So that is what I have to say. And Ravi, definite 10 minutes for, oh, Ravi left. Definite 10 minutes for questions.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been a very interesting and seems impactful talk.
Thanks.
So if anyone has any questions, feel free to either put them in the chat, use the raise hand feature, or just unmute. I also, by the way, want to encourage, if there's any students in the audience, that we'd also love to hear your questions if you have any. So yes, feel free to. Nick, yes, question.
First, thanks. This was really awesome and great to hear that it's having an impact on policy too. I'm curious how you're thinking about, and I may have missed this from before, but the pulse, does it follow the same families over time? Or is there any kind of resampling, or is it all different people?
It is different families every time. Yeah, there was an attempt to look at to follow families over time early in the pandemic, and it basically failed. The census was not able to get people to consistently participate over time. Although I do know one economist who was sampled for that and did participate over time, and he was very disappointed to hear that everyone else had not. It would be great if we had panels, right? But unfortunately, we do not have panels in the polls.
So that my question is how you think that influences, in particular, your confidence in each of the individual estimates, if these are cross-sectional rather than an actual panel of people.
Yeah, so I think especially if you think about the event study, right? So you're just saying, here's a sample of people with kids and people without kids. What's the difference in their labor supply, right? In April, and the answer is not much, right? And then you do that again in May for a different sample, right? So it's actually a new, fresh, independent experiment, and again you get the answer not much. If anything, families with kids, the point estimate is a little below 0, right? So they're a little less likely to work. And then all of a sudden, you say, okay, let's look now in July, right? And we'll resample, we'll do a new experiment. Now there's also not much difference. If anything, it's a little positive. So I think, in that sense, actually having the fresh samples in some ways reinforces our let's do independent experiments, thought experiment about this. This is very clean. What we've got is a bunch of experiments over time, and they're giving us the same answer, even though there's this change. Thanks. Other questions? And Robert, I do see you. Sorry, I couldn't see your picture once you stopped talking, but your name is Robert, and I apologize.
Pat?
So this is a great talk, and I appreciate your efforts to look carefully at the some of the alternative approaches. But I was just thinking about these policymakers or the congressmen who are not supporting continuing this. They have a tendency to think that all scientists are biased and produce results that are just consistent with their expectations. So I'm just wondering, so you had to play devil's advocate, or did you in fact have on your team economists that were willing to place their own resources and bets on different outcomes? And if so, is there a way to tell the story to say that you took a bunch of people with different points of view and the data changed the posterior belief in those ideas?
Yeah, so I will actually put myself among the folks who originally, and I would say all of the economists on our team originally expected there to be negative employment effects, and our sense was that they were likely to be small enough that on net this was still really beneficial to children, right? And so what we expected to find was there were small disemployment effects, and for those families, their kids wouldn't be better off, right? But that overall, our best bet was that food insufficiency would decrease, and that would be in spite of some parents not looking as hard for work, et cetera, because of this policy. So the rationales that I showed you for why this wouldn't happen are ex post. We started digging into the literature, like, so how could this be? For years, like, I teach the income and substitution effects of, that is the bread and butter of a labor economist. And I had become convinced, many of us had believed, including myself, that giving people money independent of work would decrease labor supply. And it was a lot of work by some economists studying, the child allowance in Canada and whatnot, that convinced economists, okay, just giving people money doesn't seem to decrease their work. But still, if you give people money at the same time you cut their wage, like, can you imagine winning the lottery and then the next day you walk into work and your boss announces that in addition to the fact that your aunt just left you an inheritance or whatnot, your boss is now cutting your wage? Like, you're for sure not going to respond to that by saying, like, oh great, I'm gonna keep working, or I'm gonna work more, right? I've taught that for years with great confidence. And so this has really required some deep reflection on my part about what I was missing, and the other economists on the team. I think and for those of you who are other types of social scientists who are like, well, if you had ever listened to any of the sociologists about, the meaning of work, or you'd listen to the psychologists about resource scarcity and how it affects you, like, I take all my lumps, for sure. Like, this has been a humbling experience. So I think the ideological difference, the difference that maps onto US ideology that economists had, was there were some economists who believed that the change in labor supply would be so great that children on average would not be better off. And Bruce Meyer at the University of Chicago has a paper arguing that that is what will happen based on some simulations that he did. And that was, I never swallowed that because it seemed like why would you stop work? Why would a large group of people stop work, thereby leading their families to be worse off? Rather than using this money to say like, hey, now we're gonna be better off. Like a few families don't look as hard for work and they end up worse off. That I would have believed. But so that was, I would say, more the ideological divide, whereas this has really involved a rethinking on all of our parts.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I see Robert has his hand up again.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, part of this policy picture, I wonder how much has to do with how surprisingly not terribly popular the child tax credit was, like in terms of public opinion. You know, if it's having all of these great effects, you would have expected it to be popular than it was. And
I mean, it wasn't, to be clear, popular, right? Like a significant majority of Americans liked it. It's just that's you know, not as overwhelmingly popular as you might expect it to be. But of course, most people don't have minor children. Like a majority of Americans don't have minor children. So you are having like the families with kids like it, and then a bunch of other people. I don't know if there are political scientists in the room, but it turns out that the correlation between popular opinion about a policy and its probability of being enacted or maintained is, does anybody want to guess? It's actually 0. There's just, I mean, and I've had some people say like, well, at least it's not negative, but it is in fact 0. So I'm not actually sure that it's the lack of, because I mean, if you look at like a lot of policies that are incredibly popular across the political spectrum, like raising the minimum wage, it's like has 80% support, including majority support among Republicans. It doesn't get enacted. There's a disconnect between popular opinion and what is correlated with whether policies get enacted and maintained is elite opinion.
well, that's going to make my question somewhat moot, but I'm curious to what extent people might be thinking of it less as an increase in the child tax credit and more an advance on the child tax credit that they would have received on their taxes. And I wonder, like the payment that they'll get on their refund is going to be less than it was previously, because although the total amount was higher, they've already received 6 months of it ahead of time, and so now it's, you know, more, but then half of that. And I'm curious if people sort of had this negative reaction to an expected sort of like an anchoring of what they expected their return to be.
Yeah, so there's so there's a bunch of modeling that you can do based on how sophisticated you think people are about understanding what their full tax liability is going to be and how much they're able to smooth. The empirical evidence isn't super consistent with anybody being super, because if we think everybody in the perfect econ model world has complete liquidity and consumes based off of their permanent income, then there shouldn't have been any changes at all in July, right? So when you're getting to super sophisticated people, like they should have, if they were going to respond, they should have responded in March when the policy was announced, right? When we look at that, because we have looked at that, because we have referees who totally buy this model, it turns out there were no changes in March, right? So nobody's that super forward looking. It's also the case that because of changes in other policies under the ARP, almost everybody got larger tax returns in 2020, in spring of 22, than they would have otherwise. So to the extent that like you like having a certain amount of money in March to do some stuff for the year, that actually, basically nobody faced an expected drop in the size of the check they were going to get in March.
All right, so we are out of time. Thank you again for such a great talk.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks everyone for attending. Our next seminar is 2 weeks from today, so on the 19th, and we hope to see you there.